Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal. This is where you can always go to see everything in politics and public policy and what's happening with your state government. Today we've got a bunch of breaking news developments that happened over the week with the General Assembly back in session just for this week, and they'll be back next month. We'll see what's going on then. This week, the passage of the Political Terrorism Prevention Act in the North Carolina House. And then Iryna's law, a new criminal justice bill, goes to the governor's desk. We'll break that down, tell you what's inside. And Vice President J.D. Vance visits Concord. So with me this week, of course, Mitch Kokai with the John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal's Catherine Zender. What do you think, Katie or Catherine? Both?
Both, sure.
All right, good. We call her Katie around here, of course. Okay, a lot going on this week. First, let's talk about Iryna's law. It passed in response to the Charlotte murder of a young woman on the light rail there in Charlotte back in August. Really got a lot of national, even global attention, and a lot on the city of Charlotte. The General Assembly proposed and passed some key provisions in a new bill. Then that bill is now in front of Governor Josh Stein. I'm curious to see what he does. We'll be talking more about that, what we can expect. Here are some big things that are inside that bill that's sitting on his desk. Stricter pretrial rules for violent offenders, ends cashless bail for certain crimes, mandatory mental health evaluations in some cases, GPS monitoring and house arrest for some violent crimes, and it requires judges to review criminal history and issue some written findings. We also, inside that bill, stronger oversight of judges and magistrates and faster death penalty appeals. This is something that drew a lot of attention there on the floor. Katie's going to give us an update on that, and some new aggravating factors for getting the death penalty, including if it happens on public transportation, and then more study on mental health, pretrial detention, and even execution methods for the death penalty. So we're going to be talking about all of that going forward. Katie, you've been covering this bill all week. It's been a very long week there and late night debates talking about it. What were lawmakers' biggest motivations in getting this bill through the General Assembly quickly? 4 days, not even 4 days through this.
Yeah.
Tell me, how did that debate play out, and why do you think they really wanted to move this quickly?
Yeah, so they moved this really quickly. It was introduced on Monday.
Okay.
It made its way very quickly through Senate committees, Judiciary, Appropriations, and then Rules, and then it made its way to the Senate floor, where there was quite a lot of significant debate, especially over the death penalty. That is one of the most highly contentious aspects of this law. And so Senator Berger actually introduced an amendment that establishes lethal injection as the primary default method of the death penalty here in North Carolina. Of course, there are, the electric chair and then the firing squad, which is not used very often, of course.
Right.
But Senator Greg Meyer had some really serious concerns in terms of the death penalty. So he, along with many other, Democratic senators, had, a lot of concerns regarding the death penalty. But it ultimately passed on the Senate floor 28-8. No Senate Democrats, however, did vote for it on the Senate floor. So all the Democrats either didn't vote against it, or a lot of them just left because they knew it wasn't going to pass anyway. So a lot of them just left.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and Republicans really pushed this, said, look, we have a lot of holes in this system, and the pretrial process for some of these most violent crimes created the situation that we saw in Charlotte. Tell me a little bit about what they were saying about how important the cashless bail and some of the things that happen before a suspect goes to trial.
Right. So there's a lot of emphasis around the fact that this guy was arrested 14 times and then he was released on a promise to appear. And so the law enforcement officers are doing their jobs, but the guidelines for the judges are so kind of loose that it doesn't necessarily keep these violent criminals off the streets. And so there was a lot of concern around that we need to be tightening these pretrial conditions to keep people that are going to be a danger to society off the streets before they come to their hearing or their trial. Yeah.
Sure. The death penalty is something that this was a lot of discussion in this about bringing it back. North Carolina's been on sort of a de facto moratorium for 20 years or so. Tell me a little bit about that. Why it's legal here, but it's not been used.
And it's been because of some legal roadblocks.
Okay.
And that was really what the legislation, the part of the legislation that deals with the death penalty was designed to do, was to clear these roadblocks that have been put up judicially. basically, the death penalty has been legal in North Carolina ever since it was resumed nationwide.
Okay.
And we had executions for a while. We haven't had one for almost 20 years now, but that has been because of these judicial roadblocks. And so what was done in this legislation was to say, okay, let's put some things in place so that we no longer have the judicial roadblocks, that the part about lethal injection being the preferred method. Lethal injection was what was used when it came
Sure.
back, but I think the idea was if for some reason someone says that becomes cruel and unusual punishment, you will have these other options.
Sure.
One of the other key pieces was that if you have these death penalty appeals, that you speed the process of making sure that they are addressed, and so that something had to be put in place by 2026 and a hearing had to take place by 2027 just so these things are resolved. I mean, remember, we have more than 120 people now on death row.
Right.
They're just kind of sitting there. The taxpayers are paying to keep them on death row in central prison, and the idea was let's get this moving. We have the death penalty in North Carolina, but it just hasn't been used because of some roadblocks that have been put in place by the courts and the General Assembly wanting to put the will of the people
Sure.
in progress, that they support the death penalty, at least a majority of them do, say, well, let's get rid of these judicial roadblocks, and this was a way to do it. One thing that struck me in general about this legislation was it really did tackle a number of the things that you had heard about the suspect
Sure.
after this first came out. And of course, remember, it took a little while between the time that this killing happened and the time that it really exploded, because no one had seen the video.
Video did everything,
but once
yeah.
the video came out, people said, wait a minute, this is terrible.
Right.
And then they started looking into this character, DeCarlos Brown Jr., found, as Katie mentioned, that he had been in and out of the courts 14 times.
Sure.
And that he had a history of all of this strange and violent behavior. And so not only did you look at the thing about cashless bail and the promise to appear, but also there are significant elements in there about mental health.
Sure.
And trying to look at the intersection between the court system and mental health. What are some of the failures there? What needs to be done? So even though it's kind of a tough on crime bill and something that you might expect, it's not just tough on crime. It's
Right.
let's look at this particular problem and what are all the factors that contributed to it, and let's try to address them in many different ways. As to your question about why this was done so quickly, part of it is because the General Assembly had a really short timeline. I mean,
Right.
they're really, for the most part, done with their work for the year,
Sure.
but they have set aside a couple of days here and there almost every month to deal with issues. They had a couple of days set aside in August and didn't end up doing anything. They had these couple of days set aside in September, decided let's go ahead and knock this out, plus a couple of other things, some
Sure.
of which we're going to be talking about. And then they have a couple more days in October, November, and basically every month. So if they are going to get things done between now and the time they come back for their short session next spring, it will look like it's very quick
Right.
because it will have to be done in a short window.
Sure, sure. And part of the reason, I think also the reason it moved so quickly was they're riding a wave of public sentiment. You know, they may not get the chance to get something like this passed if there wasn't such a horrific visible crime that happened and so much public outrage. It gave them a chance to say, I'm going to take advantage of this energy that's coming from the public, from my constituents, and get these things that have needed to be on the books for a long time, get them through the General Assembly. And there, you can't underestimate the value of, you know, public push for something like this.
That's right. And one thing that's significant to note about this bill, and only a couple of others that came up this week, one of which being another budget adjustment that had
Sure.
some more hurricane relief, and then a third that was a reg reform bill.
Right.
These bills had some buy-in from both chambers by the time you got there. This is basically the Senate took some House bills,
Yeah.
gutted them, put these new provisions in there, and then the House concurred.
Sure.
So basically, all sides, at least among the Republicans, agreed we're going to do something.
Sure.
But there are other bills, including one I know we're going to talk about, where either the House or Senate took action, but not both, which means they still have some room to work on
Sure,
things.
sure. One of the biggest things that came out of this to me was that the information about magistrates. I don't think I understood that magistrates in North Carolina don't have to be a lawyer. They're not a judge. They function as a judge. It seems that they function as a
respects.
judge, but they have a tremendous amount of, background, not as many background restrictions, and they don't have, set guidelines on how to set bail and how much bail to ask. Do you think that this is something that will warrant further legislation, further guidelines for magistrates?
My guess is there will probably be at least some work on that.
Okay.
But I think a lot of people had the same
Sure.
sort of
I was
questions
shocked.
that we all did, that, magistrates really have that much authority and
Right.
have that little guidance and training about what they should be doing.
Right.
My guess is that probably is a longer conversation for a future time beyond this immediate need to do something.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the other bills that you've covered, of course, this week, the Political Terrorism Bill. So this is something that came after the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, something that was, certainly devastating event in my own family with my kids. But North Carolina lawmakers really moved quickly in the House,
Yes.
to advance a Political Terrorism Prevention Act. It stiffens penalties for politically motivated violence. Tell me about this in the House. And we did not see action, like you mentioned, in the Senate.
Right. So this dropped in the House on Tuesday, and it passed very quickly in a 105-6 vote.
Wow.
But not after some debate, not as much debate as the other bill, but after
Sure.
some debate. It has not moved through the Senate yet. That'll probably come next month. But yeah, so this is Senate Bill 13. It's called the Political Terrorism Prevention Act. As you said, it's in response to Charlie Kirk's assassination, and it does a couple of things. It defines politically motivated violence as any criminal offense committed against an individual because of their political beliefs, their affiliations, their candidacy, their voting history, their advocacy, or lawful political expression. And then another thing it does, it has something called the Charlie Kirk Clause, which states that politically motivated murder can serve as an aggravating factor in death penalty proceedings.
Okay.
And so there was some debate on this. It enhances sentence enhancement. It includes sentence enhancements
Sure.
for politically motivated crimes. Offenders would become ineligible for parole, early release, sentence reduction, those kinds of things. And so Representative Wyatt Gable, who was actually just elected in the last election, he beat the incumbent George Cleveland. He's the youngest member of the General
very
Assembly.
young.
Yeah, he's 22 years old. I believe he's a graduate of ECU. He was president of the Turning Point USA chapter there. And so he actually spoke on this. And we don't hear him speak a lot, but he said, I believe that one of the reasons I'm sitting here today is because of the work of Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was very young, and he was very influential, as you mentioned, on young conservatives, and even, I believe, making new conservatives. I think
Sure.
a lot of people that are conservatives today, especially your kids' generation, wouldn't be conservatives if it wasn't for Charlie
Right.
Kirk and what he did and
So
the
powerful.
movement that he led. Yes. So he really spoke to this, and then, of course, Brendan Jones, who's the House Majority Leader, also spoke to this as well, and he kind of took Charlie Kirk's words and he made them his own. He said, this is our turning point, and we're not going to look back from this. And so, back to Representative Gable, he said, my generation is looking to, the General Assembly and the people of North Carolina say, are you going to hold these criminals to a higher standard?
Sure, sure. I heard a big
yeah.
groan in the chamber when he said, this is our turning point.
Yes.
Where was that coming from?
So that was coming mainly from Democrats, of
Okay.
course, as you would expect.
So they all went,
yeah.
when he said,
yes.
this is our turning point.
But it did pass 105-6.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it had some support.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
largely, very much.
Very
yeah.
interesting.
So yeah, we'll keep
Yeah.
an eye on it and see what they do next
Absolutely.
month.
See if the Senate passes.
Yeah.
Do you see anything that strikes you, maybe constitutionally, anything like that in this? Because it seems like a no-brainer, but it did have a few detractors.
It did, and my suspicion is, I didn't look at all of the folks who voted against it, but my guess is maybe some of them are just, I'm not supporting anything that has anything to do with Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
But the fact that it got 105 votes is
Sure.
impressive. It didn't end up being a completely party line vote. This is something that is seen as not just a Republican bill, but a bill that makes sense to deal with
Sure.
political violence of any type. I think probably one of the reasons we only saw action in the House at this time was this was more of a late-breaking item,
Right.
even than the Charlotte light rail killing. When we saw that news conference with Phil Berger and Destin Hall, they had called a news conference to talk
Sure.
about the Charlotte light rail killing, but it ended up being the day after the Charlie Kirk thing, so they mentioned that as well. My guess is they didn't have enough time to come up with something that got buy-in from both chambers. It will be very interesting to see whether the Senate does in fact take this bill up, and if there's support on that side. we saw also the Senate came up with its own sort of law enforcement bill that only got through the Senate, was not considered in the House, and that was the bill to back the Blue Pay Act, give law enforcement officers more pay, help them in various ways. That was something that cleared the Senate on Monday, did not get on the calendar in the House. So that's another item where if this bill, which has, as Katie mentioned, has a Senate bill number, which means the Senate could vote just to concur and not have to do anything else. That bill, see if that gets through the Senate. It'll be interesting to see if the House will go along with what the Senate wants to do on paying law enforcement officers more.
Sure. Yeah, that would make a huge difference. We've also talked a little bit about the lawmakers, both chambers passed a mini budget. This is something we've been talking a lot about this, that they just have not been able to come to an agreement about a big budget for the state government. I'm not sure how many people realize that we don't have a state budget, don't know how many people really are that impacted by it, right?
And we do have one.
Yes.
It's just we don't have a new one.
Well, usually
so every 2 years what's supposed to happen is the General Assembly draws up a new 2-year budget plan, approves it. It's supposed to happen by July 1st. Almost never does, but it's supposed to happen by July 1st, and then that budget will remain in effect for 2 years. They usually come back the next year and adjust it because things, either you won't have as much money as you thought, or you'll have more money than you thought, and you can adjust how much you're going to spend. So what happens because of a law that was passed in 2016 is that if you don't have a new budget by the time the 2-year budget runs out, the old budget remains in effect. And so what the General Assembly has done now with a couple of different bills, because there was already one mini budget passed and then they passed another one this year, is they took some elements within the budget plan that they agreed to that would have been in a comprehensive budget and passed those and said, okay,
so here's our common ground.
Step pay increases that they need to take a vote on, other things that they see that we all agree on this, let's go ahead and get those in there. They passed those, but still there are some major disagreements out there, like on tax rates and on employee pay raises and things of that sort. Those will remain for another day if they take them up at all. I mean, the more mini budgets they pass, the less likely it is they'll pass a comprehensive budget, because all of the things that have to be resolved will be resolved, and so the bigger policy issues will remain on the table. We saw that there were a couple of instances in this past session when the General Assembly tried to throw in some things, like the Senate wanting to get funding for the Duke UNC Children's Hospital, and they put that in the bill. House didn't do anything with that, and that was one of the bones of contention in the main budget debate. And so I'm guessing if they do come back, we may see some more of that. Hey, take this piece of our budget, and we'll give you a little bit more of what you want. And it remains to be seen whether that will be resolved.
Yeah, this horse trading process is so interesting to watch, but I do think the more mini budgets, the less likely we're going to get a big one for sure. So the one that passed this week had some top spending items in there, lots in there, but here's the big ones that we've been following. One is $35 million for the Lenovo Center expansion. That money actually goes to the Centennial Authority. This is that big project in Raleigh that folks have been talking about around the hurricanes. Also $65.5 million for storm recovery from Helene and Chantal. $51 million for Hartford County to build a dock and some road access. That actually is when there was some discussion that they have a potential a company coming in, a steel manufacturer coming in, and that's what that would be for. $10.5 million for the Coastal Carolina Regional Airport. $3.6 million for Tri-County Airport hangar upgrades, and then there was something in there about money for not quite $1 million for RDU to Dublin air service, which I'm not quite sure how the state government is involved in that. But there's a few other things in there, some residential schools for Governor Moorhead, school for the deaf, and then 3 attorneys' positions at the Department of Labor and security funding for the Department of Labor. So interesting little hodgepodge of things. The big one, though, the Lenovo Center got my attention, certainly hurricane relief, but the Lenovo Center, this is something here, if you live in the Raleigh area, you're paying attention because this is going to be like massive entertainment district with parking and tailgating and whatever. What are you hearing about that?
Right, so they're doing renovations and reconstruction and all this stuff on the Lenovo Center, and they're also looking to kind of build an entertainment district in the Lenovo Center area. And so one of the interesting things things about this is, they're hoping to bring in, retail, parking, hotels, all of that thing in the
Sure.
Lenovo area. But one of the interesting things is the MLB is looking to expand. So
Okay.
Major League Baseball is looking to expand. About a month ago, Rob Manfred, who's the commissioner of the MLB, says that by the time he retires in 2029, he wants to have locations for 2 new MLB teams.
Okay.
Now, according to a study by Dr. Michael Walden, he's an economist at NC State,
Okay.
there are 10 top cities that are kind of in contention for these locations. 2 of them are right here in North Carolina, and that's Raleigh and Charlotte. And so one of the locations that is kind of speculated for a potential Raleigh MLB team would be that entertainment district. One of the concerns with that, though, is there enough space? Because the Lenovo Center isn't that big, and even with these renovations that they're doing on it, I'm not that sure that it's going to be big enough to hold an MLB team. And then you've got parking and all these other considerations, but that is something to
Sure.
consider and to look at. So it's kind of interesting for Raleigh folks, especially. Yeah.
Sure.
Maybe as a Carolina fan, I could
Yeah.
say they could always just get rid of the
Right.
Carter-Finley Stadium and put it there.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
I'm not serious Wolfpack people, but that would be an option.
Right. What strikes you about this mini budget? Well, one, what does it say about our legislative priorities? But what would the John Locke Foundation say about some of these things?
Well, some of these things look like
Yeah.
sort of giveaways to particular districts and not necessarily of statewide interest, but that has become commonplace over the years
Right.
in budgets. It does show that there are some areas of agreement
Yeah.
with the House and Senate, and they say, okay, well, we all agree to do this. And the more that they are likely to agree on those little items, the less likely they will agree on the other things that are dividing them.
Sure.
The whole thing about the Lenovo Center, it kind of makes you shake your head that the state government is paying for what is largely a Carolina Hurricanes operation, but remember, this is a publicly owned building.
Sure.
So anything that's done, not with the entertainment district part, which all should be private funding,
Right.
but the actual building and improving the building, it is a publicly owned building,
Sure.
even though it's run by the Hurricanes. And so there is at least some legitimate argument for
Right.
making those renovations. Now, how much the public should be paying for it and how
Sure.
much should the Hurricanes be paying for it, that's another question. But there is something in there. Now, there was another bill that the Senate passed but was never put on the House calendar
Okay.
that would have been a third mini budget bill, because
Okay.
they'd already passed one. They passed the one this week. There was a third one that the Senate passed, was not even considered by the House, that had a provision that all of us at the John Locke Foundation should like, and it's one that sometimes is called the INSCO rule.
Yes.
Because
Oh,
former
right.
Representative Verla INSCO talked about doing this, and that is if there's a budget provision that's changing something that's in the base budget projections, that provision should identify which member called for it.
Oh, so you gotta put your name on it.
So if you're asking for extra money for this or that, you have to put your name to it. And that's
interesting.
something that the Senate
love that.
passed and passed overwhelmingly. It was not put on the House for consideration. So we'll see if that crops up when they come back to town.
That would be exciting, actually, because you could do all kinds of information with that. It's really, what the public needs to know.
There's that. There's also the deterrent factor.
Sure.
That if you don't want your name associated with something that's not really a high priority, you won't do it.
Right.
So, yes, it shines light on the people who want to put in a new provision. It also deters those who know this really isn't a great idea,
Right.
and I don't want my name associated with it.
Sure.
It deters them from putting stuff in the budget that no one ever claims credit for, that is certainly not something that state taxpayers ought to be paying for.
All right, we're going to watch really closely to see if the House picks that up. As we wrap it up here, just wanted to let you know first that if you haven't already heard, it seems like it was pretty well known. J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, was in Concord this week. The crowd was crazy. They had to turn people away. There was miles of cars, hours and hours of lines, and it was a very last-minute event. So I was surprised that many people turned out. Here's a little bit of the video here of what he was doing and where he was. He was really using the opportunity to highlight some of the changes that need to happen. It happened the same week that we had Iryna's law pass, and he talked a little bit about her murder and some of the changes that he would like to see in criminal justice. How does this talk about the broader debate about, political violence, crime, all of these things. It just seems to have bubbled up here in the last, say, 6 weeks.
Well, it's certainly an issue that's of interest to the Trump administration
Sure.
and to Vice President Vance, and I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why they decided to come down to Concord, because they could tie it in
Yeah.
to what happened with Iryna's law, but also talk about Charlie Kirk's assassination and the contention from Vice President Vance that members of the media and Democrats are basically out there trying to convince crazy people to commit violence.
Right.
I mean, that was his words, not mine. But I think it fits in with a key Trump administration theme that there's too much political violence. Now, of course, the response on the other side is, well, you guys do it too, and the rhetoric can be harmful on both sides. But certainly it is a key point that the Trump administration wants to make. I can tell you one other interesting little tidbit. One of the people who was invited to meet with Vice President Vance was one of the key people behind some of the provisions in Iryna's law, Representative Sarah Stevens of Surrey County. She wasn't there, and the reason she wasn't there, she was where I was, meeting with the Craven County Republican women, and she told them, hey, I was invited to speak or to meet with J.D. Vance, but I already had this engagement. I decided to come to hang out with you.
Right.
So, and of course, Sarah Stevens is running for state Supreme Court, which is one of the reasons why she's making the rounds. But yes, having J.D. Vance in North Carolina on this theme certainly raises the state's profile, raises the issue's profile.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anything strike you about his visit?
Yeah, I mean, the timing of it was very interesting.
Sure.
But he talked a lot, about public safety and about how law enforcement officers are doing their job, and it's really just we need legislation like Iryna's law to kind of,
Right.
enforce these tight guidelines and pretrial release conditions. So
Yeah, and his popularity there among the
Yes.
public was really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for joining us here on the Debrief. Lots to talk about, public safety, life, liberty, public trust, shaping our politics. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure you hit it next time. We'll be right back here on Thursday, and check out carolinajournal.com for more details on all of this information and lots of good analysis. Did you learn something? Make sure you subscribe to Carolina Journal's YouTube channel and watch the Debrief every week, where we're going to be breaking down everything happening in your state government. And check out carolinajournal.com for the latest breaking news.